Welcome to Out Motorsports, the channel for cars as you are. My name is Jake, and this is the 2022 Jeep Grand Cherokee L. This is the second three-row SUV that Jeep has come out with for the 2022 model year, second to the Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer, which are ostensibly much larger and even more luxurious than this. But I think the Grand Cherokee L is more of an actual Grand Wagoneer successor than the Grand Wagoneer itself. So we're going to get into why in just a second, but let's also talk about where this Grand Cherokee L stands in a very crowded segment of three-row unibody large crossovers. We'll talk especially about its capabilities between towing and hauling and off-roading, and then we'll get behind the wheel and see how it is to drive. Now, if you like what we're up to, like this video, please take a second, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate all the support, and it enables more and more of what we're doing. Now with that, on to the Grand Cherokee L. So before we get into this whole Grand Cherokee L is more Grand Wagoneer than the Grand Wagoneer thing, let's talk about what the Grand Cherokee L actually is. Finally, there is no more Mercedes-Benz DNA in the Grand Cherokee. This is on an all-new platform for the 2022 model year. They finally got rid of the old WK2 platform, which was an evolution of the WK platform that started in about 2005 and had some heritage shared with the W166 generation of Mercedes-Benz ML. If you remember the Daimler Chrysler days from back then, it was one of the projects that the two companies collaborated on, and the ML, the Dodge Durango, and that Jeep Grand Cherokee all shared some elements of a platform. This is all brand new by comparison, and this being the Grand Cherokee L is a three-row crossover, which is new for the first time in Grand Cherokee history. Jeep, back in those WK days, did come out with the Commander, which was kind of the same concept of a stretched wheelbase, but it was really not that well received, and not a lot of people bought it. So this is a different effort. It is much more cohesive, if you will. And what Jeep did to create the Grand Cherokee L over the Grand Cherokee is they stretched the wheelbase of this platform by 5 inches, and then they added 11 inches of overall length to the vehicle. So you have some pretty serious stretch in the platform to add that third row seat, which means you've got some real space in all 3 rows. We'll get into that in just a second. This being all new, this being the L, the longer version of the Grand Cherokee, it does mean there is also a 2022 Grand Cherokee not L that is the same vehicle. They offer very similar color schemes, very similar options everywhere, very similar trim levels. It's just shorter. So if you don't need the third row, you can take pretty much everything I'm saying and apply it to the regular Grand Cherokee and have the same results. Now this Grand Cherokee L is the fully loaded model except the engine. We'll get to that in just a second, but this is the Grand Cherokee L Summit Reserve. So this is the top tier, and it has all sorts of nice goodies inside and out. This one in particular is powered by the smaller of the 2 engine offerings in the Grand Cherokee L. This has the corporate 3.6 liter Pentastar V6. It is a fine engine. They are known to be pretty durable at this point. I've seen examples with over 600,000 miles on them, and it is paired to an 8-speed TorqueFlite automatic transmission that feeds either the rear wheels if you, for whatever reason, want a 2-wheel drive Jeep, or if you're buying a Jeep, you can buy a 4-wheel drive version of this car that sends power to, of course, all 4 wheels. And before we get into the 4-wheel drive system, let's talk about this Pentastar for just a second. It is a pretty durable engine at this point. It's in everything from the Wrangler to the Ram ProMaster work van, and for good reason. It's durable, it's kind of understressed, it's fine. It makes about 293 horsepower and 260 pound-feet of torque in this application, and all of that power is made towards the tippy top of the rev range. It is made at 6,400 RPM, so you really have to work it. Peak torque does come in lower at about 4,000 RPM, but regardless, it's naturally aspirated. You're going to have to work it a little bit. Thankfully, you have an 8-speed transmission with a lot of different gear ratios to help you out and make the most of that power and get it down to the ground. Now, the other engine that is offered in the Grand Cherokee L right now is the tried and true 5.7 liter Hemi V8. You do get more power and torque with that, and you get another 1,000 pounds of towing capability added on according to Jeep. We'll go back to towing in a second. I really wish there was another drivetrain offered here. Jeep is about to offer the Grand Cherokee 4xE, which is a plug-in hybrid that uses both a battery electric setup and a turbocharged 2-liter 4-cylinder to produce a plug-in hybrid version of the Grand Cherokee. So far, that is only available on the shorter wheelbase regular Grand Cherokee, not the Grand Cherokee L. So we'll see if they do that with this larger Grand Cherokee L, but nothing has been announced so far. Now, as far as getting this power to the ground, I mentioned you can buy the Grand Cherokee L as a rear-wheel drive vehicle, but I don't know why you would buy a rear-wheel drive Jeep, because the whole point of a Jeep is to go almost anywhere you want, even if you have a nice big Grand Cherokee that's supposed to be nice over anything else. So you can get four-wheel drive with all of these vehicles, with all of these trim levels, of course, but the confusing and interesting thing is that Jeep offers 3 different four-wheel drive systems, and these are all technically all-wheel drive because they're always engaged. You cannot run them in two-wheel drive mode. But Jeep offers QuadraDrive 1, QuadraDrive 2, and QuadraTrac 2. And they are different and they are better, of course, the higher up you go in the lineup. So QuadraDrive 1 is your basic all-wheel drive system that comes on the lower tiers of Grand Cherokee L, and that is basically a fixed ratio all-wheel drive. So the ratio of power that runs to the rear wheels versus the front wheels is split, and all 3 of your differentials are open differentials. So to get you going, if you need some extra help, Jeep has a software setup that will try to break the spinning wheel to let the other wheel take all the power. It'll work. It is not the most ideal setup, and with that setup, you don't have a low range or anything like that. Now the next option is QuadraDrive 2, and that adds both low range and a variable torque split in the center of the Jeep. So if you have more traction at the front or the rear, the center differential on QuadraDrive 2 can actually send more power front to rear to help you out. It's not a fixed ratio like QuadraDrive 1. And then low range, of course, is different gearing, so you can push a button on the center console and slip the Jeep into low range. It will help you either get going or go down a steep hill, things like that. Very helpful. That also uses brakes to help stop a spinning wheel and send power where it needs to go. Now, the ultimate version of the four-wheel drive setup, or all-wheel drive setup, whatever you want to call it, in the Grand Cherokee L is QuadraTrac 2, and that can be found on the higher trim levels of Grand Cherokee L. And what that does, you still have that variable ratio differential in the center that uses a clutch to send power front or back. You've also got limited slip differentials in the front and rear axles that can send power to the left or right wheel. So it doesn't rely exclusively on using the brakes to stop the wheel with the least amount of traction. It can actually use mechanical bits to send the power where it needs to go. That is going to be the strongest setup to get you going. Of course, that also has low range like you would expect, and it is also paired to QuadraLift, which is Jeep's 4-wheel, 4-corner air suspension. So you get a little bit of articulation up and down if you need some extra ground clearance. You can have up to 10.9 inches of ground clearance if you have QuadraLift and put it in the tallest setting. If you don't have QuadraLift, you get 8.5 inches of ground clearance. So those lower trim Grand Cherokee Ls will have 8.5 inches as their baseline. If you have QuadraLift and you put it at the highest setting, this Grand Cherokee L can go through up to 24 inches, that is 2 feet, of standing water. So it's all very impressive. You may not need all that capability and be fine with one of the lower tier QuadraDrive systems, but that's what all those different systems are. Now, you cannot necessarily mix and match the all-wheel drive system that you want and the drivetrain that you want otherwise, based on the trim level you get. Jeep does restrict those based on the trim. So if you want the Hemi V8, you're going to have to pick a higher trim level of Grand Cherokee L. If you want one of the higher trim all-wheel drive systems, you're going to have to pick a higher trim of Grand Cherokee L. So obviously, they want to package these things in a way that makes sense for most buyers. All right, so let's talk towing, and before we talk about it, I'm gonna expose the trailer hitch, which is just 2 little finger clips down here. Pop this guy off, and you have your standard 2-inch receiver, your safety chains here, and then you've got both a 4-pin and a 7-pin trailer wiring hookup down here. Jeep does not offer a trailer brake controller built in or as an option, but they do run the wiring up under the dashboard if you want to wire something in yourself. As far as towing with this Grand Cherokee L, any Grand Cherokee L with the 3.6-liter Pentastar is rated for 6,200 pounds of towing. If you get the Hemi V8, you add 1,000 pounds to that, which is 7,200 pounds of tow capacity. Now, payload on this particular Grand Cherokee L, keep in mind, this is the 3.6-liter, and this is the fully loaded Summit Reserve, so it's one of the heavier versions you're going to get, is about 1,210 pounds. Now, if you take that maximum tongue weight, which is about 10%, so in this case about 620 pounds, take that out of your total payload, you've got about 600 pounds left that you can have for people and things inside. I will apologize that I'm not actually towing with this Grand Cherokee L. I was going to, and then we were supposed to get a bunch of snow, and then that kind of ruined all my plans, and you can see we didn't actually get that much snow. So we'll get another one, we'll do some towing with it when we have a little bit better weather, but this one is rated for 6,200, and I'm gonna tell you once we get behind the wheel and drive it why I don't know if I'd actually tow 6,200 pounds with the V6. Now, one final thing with towing with the Grand Cherokee L, historically with the WK and WK2, Jeep was okay with you using weight distribution on your hitch back here. Interesting because this is a unibody. They continue that with the WL. They are okay with this chassis using weight distribution, which of course you should do if you're towing over about 50% of the chassis' rated weight. All right, now it is fairly cold today. It's 20-something degrees, so let's hop inside this Jeep Grand Cherokee L and take it for a drive and talk about why I think this might be the better Grand Wagoneer than the Grand Wagoneer, talk about why I wouldn't necessarily tow 6,200 pounds with the V6, and just talk about how it is to drive overall. All right, so let's talk about driving the 2022 Jeep Grand Cherokee L. And before we get into the driving bit of this, I want to go back to the Grand Wagoneer comments I made, because I drove the 2022 Grand Wagoneer Series 2 a few weeks ago, and it was fine, but it wasn't necessarily Grand Wagoneer-ish to me in the sense of the old Grand Wagoneer. So I want to talk about what the Grand Cherokee nameplate and heritage are just for a minute. I know, we're almost 30 years in with the Grand Cherokee at this point, but it's worth mentioning. So if you know your Mopar Chrysler history, the Grand Cherokee came out in 1993. It was driven at the time by Bob Lutz, the Chrysler president, through a plate glass window at Cobo Hall to introduce the vehicle at the Detroit Auto Show. And it was a huge deal. And that Grand Cherokee was supposed to replace the XJ Cherokee. Back when AMC owned the Jeep brand, Chrysler came calling, they bought the Jeep brand, and they saw the ZJ, which is what it was called, and they decided the SUV market is heating up, and we're actually going to keep both vehicles, and we're going to make the Cherokee and the Grand Cherokee side by side, because the Grand was, of course, bigger and more luxurious. So that's what they did, and of course, now you see where we are with the Grand Cherokee name. So the Grand Cherokee, though, at the time, replaced the Grand Wagoneer. The Grand Wagoneer had been discontinued in 1991. It could not meet ongoing emissions and crash test standards that got tighter and tighter. As you look at what replaced it, being the Grand Cherokee, the efforts were put on the Grand Cherokee being very untrucky, being this vehicle that people wanted for both its luxury and its durability and go anywhere ruggedness that kind of was synonymous with the Jeep brand at that time. And the point that one of my friends has made several times that I agree with is that the Grand Cherokee is kind of a classless car, and not in the sense of lacking class, but in the sense of not necessarily fitting in only one demographic of type of owner. And I find that really fascinating. And the Grand Cherokee has never really been a cheap car. Even when they were new, they started at like $18,000 or $19,000 in 1993, which adjusted for inflation is still, 38 to 40 grand at this point, which is right about where this Grand Cherokee starts. If you buy the two-row, the brand new 2022, you're at $38,000 to $40,000. So pricing has kind of stayed the same. On the top end, of course, things have gotten a little more expensive versus an old 5.2 liter limited from the mid 90s, but regardless, they haven't strayed too far. And it's all, this Grand Cherokee L, especially in Summit Reserve trim like this is so cohesive. I so adore this car. And we'll get into why in a bit, but this feels like such a solid effort that comes together and just feels like everyone was talking to everyone, and it's just so well done in here. And when you think of the new Grand Wagoneer, I don't necessarily find it to be the same experience. It's just very much more of a trucky, we took all the best bits that we had from all the parts bins and put them together, and this is what we got. And that's fine, because that's what GM does with the Cadillac Escalade. It's what Ford does with the Lincoln Navigator. And I just think in both cases, those vehicles work a little better than the Grand Wagoneer works. The Grand Wagoneer doesn't necessarily convince me that it's worth the $100,000 price tag. This Grand Cherokee L Summit Reserve is fully loaded. This one is about 66 grand. You can get it to push 69 or 70 if you want the Hemi V8 instead of the Pentastar. And I think it's worth it, to be totally honest. I really do. I think it's worth the money. So, with all that said, I think this is a very cohesive vehicle. I really like it, and now let's talk about why. So first of all, seating position, like I said, this is a very trucky seating position. You're looking out over the dash, over the hood. You've got a really good commanding view of the road. You've got this digital rear view mirror, which is not exclusive to this car, but helps because the rear visibility is not super great, but this is really nice. Everything, you know, seating wise, this is very comfortable for tall people. There's an extendable thigh bolster on both front seats. These seats on the Summit Reserve are power adjustable with memory. They are heated and ventilated, and they massage you, which is really quite nice. And it's a good seating position, and I like everything I'm looking at. The wood trim everywhere, like I said, is really great. I love how it goes on the steering wheel. The steering wheel itself is a nice shape. All the buttons are well thought out for where they are. There's not an over-reliance on touch screens here. So again, just a really nice atmosphere going on. The ride, obviously this one has the four-corner QuadraLift air suspension. The ride in here is very good. I would say the ride is one of the top qualities of the Grand Cherokee L if you get this Summit Reserve or any others with the air suspension. Obviously if you get the steel springs, I can't tell you how that is by comparison because I haven't driven one. But this ride is really, really nice. And then having the toggle right here to adjust height up and down is a really nice perk. Where I don't love the basic mechanicals of this Grand Cherokee L, and this is why I mentioned, I don't know if I'd tow 6,200 pounds with the V6. The V6 is a fine engine. It is totally adequate for the job, but to me it feels a little overburdened with just one or two adults in this car. And I don't know if I'd be super excited to put 6,200 pounds behind it, plus, you know, me and another person, if you think about the available payload. And even, you know, up a hill, it dropped as low of a gear as it could to go to 5,200 RPM and just sit there to go up that hill. And it just has to work. And it sounds fine doing it, but when the rest of this car is so nice and so refined, hearing a V6 just kind of churn away at every little hill and every on-ramp just doesn't really work for me. I think in particular, it has to work so hard because this is heavy. You know, this is a big segment, very competitive with vehicles like the Ford Explorer, the Kia Telluride, the Hyundai Palisade, the Highlander, the Pilot, the Pathfinder. I'm sure there's others I've missed, but a lot of them have a large naturally aspirated V6. Telluride has a 3.8, the Pathfinder has a 3.5. Certain options like the Explorer have forced induction, they have turbocharging. In the case of the Grand Cherokee L, you've got your naturally aspirated V6 or the Hemi V8. The V6 is competitive on power and torque with things like the Pathfinder and the Telluride, both of which I've driven recently. Where this is less competitive is in its weight. This Grand Cherokee L at Summit Reserve trim, which is going to be the heaviest probably of the ones you'll look at, this is like a 5,100 pound vehicle, where the Telluride is about 4,400 pounds and the Pathfinder is like 4,600 pounds. So the Pentastar has to drag around several hundred pounds more before anyone sits down in any of these vehicles. By that alone, it has to work a lot harder. So I just don't know if I'd get into the idea of towing a whole lot. I do know someone who just completed a cross-country drive in one of these with the V6 and towed about a 4,000 pound camper all the way across country. They said it did just fine. That's my bit on the engine. I don't really love it. It's not bad per se, but I just think there's room here for something better than both the Hemi and the Pentastar. And if you look under the hood, there's a lot of room under there between where the Pentastar stops and where the radiator and the cooling system all begins. And there's some kind of rumors, kind of confirmed bits about a Mopar turbocharged mild hybrid inline 6-cylinder that is allegedly already in production in Mexico. And I think that would go a long way if there's something like that that could be stuffed under the hood here eventually, that would be forced induction, battery assisted, very silky smooth by virtue of it being an inline 6. I think that would make this truly almost a perfect vehicle. As far as other elements of how this Grand Cherokee L drives, I think from a ride quality perspective, like I said, it's great. From a handling perspective, you know, no one is making claims that this is a performance crossover at all, even with the Hemi. It's meant to be more capable and kind of go anywhere than anything else. But all that said, you know, being a big unibody, I think it does do a nice job. It feels pretty confidence-inspiring going through a corner, going through an off-ramp. It is really quite good for what it is. I'm certainly not unimpressed or upset by how it handles. Braking performance, again, is pretty good. The brake pedal has a very stiff feel on initial application, so when you first get your foot on it, it takes a little more effort than you think it should, and it bites almost immediately. Now that said, this particular Jeep only has 1,300 miles on it. I'm one of the first people to drive it, so the pads might just be brand spanking new, and as they wear in just a tad, the pedal feel might change there. But it's not an unsafe or scary pedal feel. It's just you get a lot of brakes right away if you really put your foot into it. And as far as everything else going on, as far as riding around, driving around in this Grand Cherokee L, it is nice in here. Part of what I said, about having this low dash and, long hood, that goes a long way, I think, in creating the right atmosphere. As far as the materials, the colors, it really just presents well. The other interesting thing, it's very quiet in here. I think road noise is well controlled for this kind of a vehicle. Obviously, it's pretty big. You're going to catch some wind here and there, but it's nice and quiet. It's relaxing. And then when you look at the second and third rows, the second row in this particular example has 2 captain's chairs with a center console between them. You've got 4-zone climate control in this particular Grand Cherokee L, and then the second row is heated. And I can actually fit in the third row. I wouldn't say it's the most spacious, but it is fine enough for a 6-footer to sit for a brief period of time. Would I want a road trip 3 or 4 hours in the third row? Probably not. Could I do an hour back there? Yes. Materials are pretty nice in the third row. Everyone gets USB charging ports. There are air vents back there. The only thing is where your armrests are, that is not a leather or vinyl sort of material. It's a little more rubberized, probably for durability's sake, because that's also the cargo area. And then that third row is power operated to drop down into the floor. The second row can also be dropped by power with buttons in the back of the hatch. And you get a lot of cargo room. That is one of the biggest advantages over getting the 3-row Grand Cherokee L versus the 2-row Grand Cherokee. Your cargo space is dramatically improved with the third row up or down. And then the final thing I want to talk about with the interior is the sound system. Jeep has partnered with McIntosh, not the computer people, that's Apple, but McIntosh, the audio company. They're an American audio company that is known for more or less very high-end home audio systems. And Jeep has partnered with them for the Grand Cherokee, the Grand Cherokee L, the Wagoneer, and the Grand Wagoneer. So based on the vehicle you get, they have come up with these very well thought out sound systems, according to them, that are pretty high-end, allegedly. And this Grand Cherokee L has the 19 speaker setup. You cannot get this sound system in most trims of Grand Cherokee, but on the higher ones you can get it. It is very good. You have to feed it good source material, as with any premium audio system. I really cringe when I see someone, pair their phone over Bluetooth and then stream Spotify to it. Spotify is great if you want the community elements of it, but if you want sound quality, that's not your girl. You want to go for Apple Music or Tidal, pick one of those because they stream lossless or very, very high quality sound compared to Spotify. So you want something that will give the best audio file to this system so it can process it and play it. If you give it good quality sound, this can put out some really, really nice sound. The only complaint that I have is that regardless of song, it can be a little bass heavy. I've actually turned the bass down a bit. I still find it a little bassy. It's not boomy. Everything's very tight. It is rattle free. It is crisp. It's very good sound. It's just a little bassy. On the whole, very, very pleasing sound system. And when I mention rattles, everything in here is well screwed together. This is it's just tight. And I think, going back to why I think this is perhaps the better Grand Wagoneer, the point of the Grand Wagoneer back in the day was to be the not trucky truck. And this feels like the not trucky truck. This has all the capability. It's got the hardware underneath it that will truly help you go places off-road, even if most people won't, or if you just use it in snow sometimes. That's where this leads against the competition. The Grand Wagoneer, the new Grand Wagoneer, is a trucky truck that kind of feels like a trucky truck. So that's why I say this almost spiritually feels more Grand Wagoneer-ish than the Grand Wagoneer. All right, and that is it for this review of the 2022 Jeep Grand Cherokee L Summit Reserve with the 3.6-liter Pentastar V6. Thank you so much for coming along, as always. Please make sure to like this video if you enjoyed what you saw. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell all your friends if you want to see more of what we're doing. We so appreciate all that support. If you'd like to find us elsewhere, we can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Out Motorsports, and on TikTok at the same username, and I don't really know what to do with it, so there's not much over there. If you'd like to connect with other LGBT automotive enthusiasts and motorsports competitors, please head over to outmotorsports.com. We have a whole community over there, and we would love to have you join us. Till next time, please stay safe, stay warm, be well, and we'll see you again soon.